I was set up to fail. They handed me the blueprint for failure and smiled like it was a gift. The moment hit me with cold clarity, the realization that the very people I trusted, my allies, were the architects of my destruction. It felt like a slap, sharp and bitter. I didn't explode. Instead, I studied their patterns, observing their feigned concern, their calculated laughter. I listened. It was a surgical betrayal, silent but precise. They didn't stab me. They slipped the knife under my ribs, whispering false reassurances while I bled inside. The shame was not loud. It echoed silently in the chambers of my mind, twisting into confusion, a churning storm of disbelief rapidly shifting to awareness. I wasn't incompetent. I had been set up. I learned to gather evidence, to collect receipts of my own humiliation. Each failure, each setback, became a data point in a vast constellation of their malice. I began to see the real faces behind the smiles, the wolves disguised in sheep's clothing. I felt the cold steel of resolve harden inside me. I wouldn't let this consume me. I would transform it. And so, I went dark. Blackout mode. Socially, emotionally, publicly, I vanished into the shadows, a ghost among the living. No announcements, no warnings. I turned my silence into a weapon. When you stop reacting, they panic. Silence becomes a mirror. They start to reveal themselves. I noted their unease, their glances, their whispers. From expression to observation, I became a witness to the unraveling of my own narrative. With each passing day in the shadows, I corroded the vestiges of my dependence on them. No more validation, no more neediness. Isolation became my incubator. They expected me broken, dragging my feet through the ashes of my downfall. They never expected me to rise smarter. I was ready to dissect the autopsy of the lie they spun. I studied the intricate web of connections, the beneficiaries of my despair. You don't dismantle your enemy by screaming. You do it by understanding their math. Their calculations became my guide. Pain turns surgical when wielded with purpose, and I was learning the art of precise vengeance. Every heartbeat thrummed with quiet strength. I would rewrite the entire game, not with a clamor, but with the methodical cadence of a strategist. I was becoming a maestro, orchestrating a symphony of unseen consequences. The betrayers might not know it yet, but I was packing the chaos elegantly beneath layers of silence, primed to flip the script. This was not my end. It was merely the beginning of their undoing. They didn't stab me. They slipped the knife under my ribs and then asked if I was okay. The betrayal was a subtle poison, coursing quietly through my veins, numbing my limbs while erasing the fight in me. As public humiliation settled like a leaden fog, my private collapse went undetected, concealed behind fragile smiles and careful nods. They believed I would crumple like paper. How naive. In the aftermath, I sifted through the rubble of what once felt like my life. Each failure was not a mark of inadequacy. It was a meticulously calculated step in their master plan. I embraced this truth. This wasn't incompetence. No, it was malice. A setup concealed beneath layers of deceit, decorated with the elegance of betrayal. I felt a cold resolve shifting within me. Revenge wasn't born from rage. It thrived in the shadows of reflection. I began to collect receipts, moments of their treachery written in the curvature of their smirks and the sharpness of their whispers. No more denial. I became the observer, detaching my emotions from my mind. I was no longer the victim, flailing at the rope they tightened around my throat. I was the aficionado of their demise, stepping back to watch the dance of destruction they choreographed for me. They expected me to react, to flail in public disgrace, but I had learned that silence is a mirror. When you withhold your responses, they are left to spiral. I embraced my blackout mode. I withdrew into a cocoon of solitude, distancing myself from their gaze, their judgment, their whispers. I cultivated my loneliness, weaving it into my strategy. Isolation sparkled with potential. It became my incubator. In my silence, I worked. I sharpened my mind, aligning my focus with an unyielding purpose. They imagined I was broken, but they underestimated my capacity for resilience. They didn't anticipate that I would return, not with anger, but with insight. As clarity settled, the contours of my next moves began to reveal themselves. I pictured the autopsy of their lie, the intricate web of complicity that ensnared me, each person a thread tied to my undoing. But I was not here to scream or lash out. No, I was here to dissect their fabric. Their mathematics spelled betrayal offered insights unseen to them. Real power lies not in reaction, but in meticulous understanding. With cold precision, I envisioned my comeback, stacking each piece of their treachery into a foundation for my resurgence. I was ready to flip the script, to rewrite the narrative while they continued their dance, blissfully unaware of my eyes tracking their every movement from the shadows. They had set me up to fail, but now they were merely playing into my hands. I was poised to transform this pain into something they could never anticipate. An unseen vengeance, engulfed in the silence that would soon reverberate through their lives. I disappeared, a specter retreating into the void. Social interactions faded to a low hum, notifications turned off, and I let the world believe I was broken. But in the silence, I was anything but. The absence of my presence twisted the knife deeper for them. My withdrawal became a frail echo of panic in their hearts. When you stop reacting, they panic. Silence is a mirror. They start to see themselves, crumbling under the weight of their own designs. I studied the landscape from the shadows, meticulous as a sniper preparing for the perfect shot. I observed their nervous laughter now, hollow and strained. Each glance meant for me, each dismissive gesture brought subtle truths to light. They were uneasy, uncertain, shuffling through their routine like actors forgetting their lines. I was the unseen observer, cataloging their missteps, their little victories that no longer felt so certain. In this blackout mode, I dissected not just what they had done, but who benefited from it. Their threadbare connections to my downfall, each person a note in a discordant symphony playing out in the dark. The silhouettes of their intentions hovered like specters, and I was gathering the tools I needed to rewrite the score. I turned their betrayal into a blueprint of its own, tracing pathways and recognizing patterns woven through their treachery. You don't dismantle your enemy by screaming. You do it by understanding their math. With cold precision, I began to build an arsenal of information. Whispers overheard in hallways, messages trailing through digital veins, and unguarded moments that slipped between the cracks. Each piece was a weapon, each revelation a silent dagger, and the chaos they thought they delivered upon me was slowly fueling my return. I envisioned my comeback carefully, shaping my newfound strength like clay in a sculptor's hands. Isolation, once a dull ache, became sharp and electric. I traded vulnerability for strategy, coursing through routines that no longer required the validation of my former allies. I quietly dismantled the dependencies they had instilled, trading connections for alliances formed in shadows. individuals who felt the friction of the system I once believed in. My world existed beneath theirs, a quiet rebellion, constructing new roots while their foundations began to tremor. I felt the weight shift. They expected me shattered, laboring under the weight of my public disgrace, when in fact I was nothing short of a storm brewing in the silence. With every moment that passed, I honed my clarity, sharpening the edge of my resolve until it glimmered like a blade in the dark. Soon, I would be ready to execute my plan with surgical accuracy. My past, rife with betrayal, was not an anchor but the very wind that filled my sails. They had set me up to fail, but I was about to orchestrate a shift they would never foresee. I silently reinforced my mental fortress. Behind closed doors and in the quiet hours of the night, I sculpted an image of my reckoning, a shadow carving out a path through the light. Each move I made went unnoticed, a silent buildup of power wrapped in the illusion of vulnerability. The longer I remained absent, the more I shifted their narrative into one of confusion and self-doubt. They did not yet understand that the absence of my presence had become their greatest liability. I would flip the script, rewire every connection, and when the moment was ripe, they would remain oblivious as the ground beneath them shifted, undetectable, until it was too late. My silence would speak volumes, and their orchestration of my demise would unravel in a cacophony of chaos I was ready to control. The flipping had begun, and they were unwitting players in a game I was redefining. The game was never mine. It was theirs, meticulously designed to keep me contained within the boundaries they dictated. But even the best-laid plans can fray. Discomfort creates fissures, and I was beginning to see them unravel. Every whispered insult, each veiled conversation in corridors meant to slice my reputation, became fodder for understanding. I was peeling back their layers, each revelation a breadcrumb leading deeper into the labyrinth of their deception. You don't need to shake the walls to threaten a fortress. All it takes is the quiet click of knowledge, the threads of their strategies laid bare. I dissected their intentions like a surgeon, extracting vital pieces with a scalpel of insight. It wasn't panic driving their cruel tactics anymore. It was desperation, the palpable fear of exposure lurking behind their feigned indifference. My absence had transformed from a vacuum they celebrated into a haunting presence echoing through their hollow smiles. They thought they had silenced me, rendered me irrelevant. They could not have been more mistaken. Each day spent laboring in the shadows nourished my growth, a phoenix not yet risen but sharpening its talons within the ashes. Isolation was my ally. In those quiet hours, I reconstructed not just my narrative but the very landscape of our interactions, each betrayal scrutinized, recontextualized. I began to understand not just the who but the why, the motivations threading through their deceit like veins in living tissue. As I gathered their mistakes, my arsenal of information morphed into a visible force. Their missteps were not just blunders. They were seeds of my strategy. Every time they adjusted their masks to hide their uncertainty, I noted the cracks, the moments when their facade wavered. Their laughter turned brittle, nerves skittered in the corners of their eyes as they found themselves glancing over their shoulders. A tremor of insecurity rippled through their ranks, a tremor they couldn't shake off. The autopsy of the lies was thorough, revealing the connections each of them had to my failures. I charted the beneficiaries of my collapse, tracing lines of complicity like an artist mapping constellations in a dark sky. You don't dismantle your enemy by screaming. You do it by revealing their truths as I laid bare their connections, turning their strengths into their vulnerabilities. Each name became an anchor. Each move they made a step deeper into a trap of their own design. I no longer sought validation. Instead, I birthed a new purpose. My silence became the canvas. Their ignorance painted the scene. I smiled inside, a soft but potent feeling. They expected a victim, a scapegoat. They had miscalculated. I was the architect of my resurgence, laying down the foundations while they floundered. Knowledge was my currency, patience my weapon. As the days turned into weeks, I felt the momentum shift. Their complacency had transformed into unrest. They began to turn on one another. The delicate threads binding their allegiances snapped one by one, each fracture sending ripples through their once cohesive unit. Paranoia was a cruel mistress, but I had learned that still waters run deep. They cast glances at one another, whispering about the missing ghost that was now a phantom menace lurking just beyond the edges of their fear. I watched them, carefully and with the kind of detachment that allowed clarity to reign. My moment would come not in a flash of fury, but with the deftness of a puppeteer pulling strings. They would be dancing on a stage I had meticulously crafted, unaware of the final act approaching. The laws of gravity had shifted. They were spiraling into chaos while I remained steady as the eye of the storm. Patience was no longer a tactic. It was a strategy, a powerful calm before an impending tempest. And when I finally stepped back into the light, they would not see me coming. This was my time, a slow ignition to a blaze they would never anticipate, a veiled retaliation that would reverberate long after the first domino fell. I occupied the shadows, an architect of my own silence, weaving plans in the invisible threads of my absence. They had painted me as the fallen, but I was anything but. Their laughter, once a soundtrack of my downfall, now rang hollow, a chorus echoing through the void I had created. Each day they played their charade of superiority, their ignorance radiating like a beacon of misplaced confidence. They thought I was out. They thought I was broken. How naive. In the field of their miscalculations, I became an observer, dissecting behaviors like a surgeon probes for tumors. Each forced smile and every nervous glance revealed fractures in their facade. I watched as they braced themselves against the uncertainty I had secretly injected into their lives. Their self-assuredness was beginning to reveal its inherent fragility, an ominous prelude to the chaos that awaited. Stripped of my former vitality, I navigated these new terrains with surgical precision. Routines subtle as whispers, alliances cultivated in the hush of forgotten conversations. I gathered fragments of information stolen from the night, a text left open on a colleague's phone, hushed conversations barely a breath above silence, and damning judgments thrown like stones in my absence. I assembled a collection of their treachery, each piece fitting together in a mosaic of imminent downfall. No longer did I crave validation from the crowd that once cheered for my demise. I had replaced desperation with strategized solitude, cultivating a new ecosystem of silent power, an underground network of allies who thrived in the darkness, just as I now did. These connections remained unseen, but they held the potential to dismantle the very architecture of my betrayers. They marveled at their own reflection in the mirror they thought they held up to me, oblivious to the dark beauty brewing just beyond their line of sight. They expected weakness, anticipated feeble cries for recognition. What they didn't predict was my sharpened intellect, carving pathways they could not see. I would not dash into the light. I would remain cloaked, silent, a ghost circulating their offices, drifting in and out of their perceptions. A whisper of disquiet. I felt the tides turning, each sigh of impatience from them resonating deeply in me, stirring waves of quiet satisfaction. Trust among them started to erode. They exchanged furtive glances, suspicion tugging at the corners of their camaraderie. I was not merely absent. I had become a specter, laying siege to the foundations of their alliances, intricate as any fortress but crumbling under my steady gaze. As I prepared the final act of my orchestration, the sniper's eye settled on its target. Timing was everything. The thrill of quiet dominance surged through me. I would not reveal my hand until the stakes were at their highest. The silence that hung between us was charged, a thrumming resonance echoing the impending storm. Their reality would shift like sand beneath their feet, their illusions sinking while I stood resolute at the center, a pivoting point between their past triumphs and my approaching resurgence. They neglected an essential truth. I was still here, not in flames, but in quiet storm. When I finally unveiled my hand, they'd find the script flipped, the power dynamics restructured in trenches they'd forgotten to monitor. I didn't need their acknowledgement. I sought only the impact of my unseen machinations. Each move was a calculated wrinkle in their fate, leading to an unraveling they would watch in silent horror. They expected me broken. They never anticipated I would become smarter. Their downfall was no longer an abstract thought. It was a meticulously crafted outcome, and they were perpetually unaware of the chains of their own making. I embraced the emptiness around me, knowing it was fertile ground for a resurrection. I had become the ghost of my own annihilation, and in that darkness, they would soon find themselves ensnared. I stood at the edge of my carefully constructed silence, feeling the weight of the shadows around me. The world outside thrummed with activity, but I had never been more attuned to the hidden vibrations just below the surface. I was the unseen witness, poised to pull the strings of a well-rehearsed performance. However, the unsettling buzz of uncertainty rippled through the air, setting my instincts on high alert. A slip, a whisper, an unexpected glance, all indicators of a disruption in my meticulously plotted course. It happened subtly. I could feel their eyes searching for the ghost I had become. They were digging through the rubble I left behind, piecing together fragments of forgotten conversations and half-remembered promises. I had them rattled, no doubt, but they were fueled by desperation, always an unpredictable catalyst. And therein lay the danger. They never anticipated I'd embrace the solitude, fortifying myself while they expected me to crumble. Yet now I sensed an emergence of shadows in their ranks, those who might have seen through the veil I carefully draped. A sudden tension unfurling amongst them. It was their awareness clawing at the edges of their complacency. They began to huddle. Their whispers grew louder, a dissonant harmony I hadn't aligned with my own ambitions. It felt like my invisibility was fraying, making it easier for them to grasp the implications of my absence. Each failed attempt at normalcy and each fake laugh they shared transformed into echoes of danger. I had birthed them into a false belief in their own security, and now those flickering lights of insight were threatening to illuminate the edges of my darkness. My mind spun, reconfiguring the chaos. I needed to recalibrate, sharpen the knife that had dulled in my absence, lest their overreach cut deeper than I intended. It was time to slip further into the depths, to weave through the cracks of their paranoia. Dangerous territory, but a risk I was willing to take. As I pulled back, cloaking myself in deeper layers of silence, I tightened my focus. Each out-of-place word, every fearful glance exchanged, became raw data against the backdrop of their treachery. They remained unaware that their unraveling was as crucial to my strategy as their initial betrayal. I could intercept their moves, threading unseen lines of deception out of their own fears. Yet my fortification brought both clarity and doubt. Perhaps I had underestimated their resilience. Were they assembling, rallying like a battalion spurred by a common fear? A pang of urgency clawed at me. Could I still master this narrative? Or had I pushed too far into the shadow? I sharpened my resolve. Loss was not an option. I wouldn't allow my patience, all those weeks in isolation, to become a discarded gamble. I realized now that sometimes the script doesn't flip with the expected flourish. It shifts in silence, incrementally. Each of my observations was a notch in my belt, a reminder that knowledge is the horizon beyond chaos, a restructuring, a recalibration of the frayed plot. I would spin a web from their own hesitation, wrapping them tighter into the confines they had fashioned for me. They would return to their positions, overconfident in my absence, unaware that the threads connecting their betrayal were being magnified, scrutinized. I would become both the puppet master and the final act. They expected me broken. What they didn't expect was a recalibrated narrative crafted from their very doubt. I stepped back into the shadows, allowing the darkness to embrace me once more. I would let the echoes of my presence resonate, slowly folding into their own fears and anxieties. I became a part of the silence, a chilling reminder that the calm before the storm was often the most dangerous place to be. The blade, once again honed, awaited my command to strike. I stood on the precipice of my own silence, the calculated void I had carved out swelling with latent power. No longer just a specter, I became a force, a dark current beneath the surface of their ignorance. They operated on the belief that I had vanished, lost in the shadows, but they underestimated the predator lurking within. All the while, I meticulously observed their maneuvers, each moment a calculated play in the larger game. My heart became a metronome, steady and unyielding, as their undertones of unease rippled through their ranks. The power I once relinquished was now coursing back into my veins, twisting and turning with newfound purpose. I could hear the nuances of their conversations shift. What once was laughter now felt like brittle glass, threatened by the weight of their own insecurities. They believed in their facade, but like fragile china, I was counting the cracks. With every whisper overheard, every glance exchanged, I realized they were no longer unified. They were fraying at seams I'd be the architect of. They had built their little kingdom on my downfall, blissfully unaware of the slow erosion happening in real time. I wasn't just collecting evidence. I was rewiring the entire power dynamic with surgical precision. The remnants of their betrayal morphed into my instruments of quiet revolution. My transformation unfolded like a meticulously crafted blueprint. I revisited the design of their machinations, my mind a scalpel splitting through layers of deceit with honed accuracy. I studied the corridors, the subtle nods exchanged between those who thrived on my misery. It wasn't enough to simply dismantle their schemes. I needed to make them irrelevant. Failure was no longer on the horizon. It was their reality. You don't have to kill the king, I reminded myself. You just make him irrelevant. My mind whirred with potential scenarios, weaving intricate webs of influence that would leave them grasping at straws. As they reveled in their short-lived victories, I laid plans that were indirect yet devastating, a rerouting of currents that would leave them shocked and unprepared. My silence became their enemy, sowing seeds of doubt that would bloom silently into paranoia. Days turned into weeks, each moment stretching into the fabric of my intent. While they sought to bind my fate with their deluded sense of control, I worked in darkness, joining the pieces together with threads they couldn't see. I cultivated allies in whispers, forging bonds that existed outside of their scrutiny. Those who had tasted betrayal found refuge in my cause, and as their strength melded with my focus, I became the architect of a new narrative altogether. The exhilarating thrill of anticipation coursed through me as I executed my quiet strike. Each maneuver was calculated, a deft impression in the sands of their arrogance, pulling the rug out from under their feet without so much as a sound. They expected a confrontation, a loud return from the depths they believed had consumed me. Instead, I transformed a power struggle into a chess game wherein I had crafted a checkmate without revealing my queen. They hungered for validation in their transitions, assuming they had captured the spotlight while I remained on the sidelines. But I was no longer performing. I was the puppeteer, my fingers dancing delicately around the strings that held their fates intertwined. Each misstep, every subtle manifestation of doubt, played to my advantage as I constructed a masterpiece of chaos masked in tranquility. The satisfaction didn't erupt from screams or chaos. It ignited within me upon recognizing their defeat, a sublime, silent reassurance that I could orchestrate this collapse without shedding a single tear. The tower they'd built on my downfall would soon tremble, not from the violence of an attack, but from the weight of their own schemes falling to ruin. And so, I waited. I fine-tuned my control over the narrative, letting their comfort coalesce into a false sense of security. The distance I had maintained would soon close, not in an act of war, but in the strategic unveiling of the larger game I had been playing all along. The grand reveal would come like thunder on a clear day, an effect of my mastery they had never anticipated. In their arrogance, they had cast aside caution and welcomed their own demise, while I became the hand that would silently guide their downfall. This was my moment, cold, calculated, and deliberate. The final push would come when they least expected it, when they were basking in the glow of their perceived dominance. By then, they would be merely players in a script I had been rewriting in silence, all leading to my triumphant emergence from this careful cocoon of shadows. Revenge wasn't merely emotional chaos. It had transformed into an art form, cold and clinical, devoid of flair yet brimming with precision. I was ready to pivot from the shadows into the light, where the echoes of their failures would forever resonate. My plan was evolving, tighter, smarter, more dangerous. I was no longer a victim. I had become the undisputed master of my fate. I watched as their empire began to tremble, cracks spidering through their confident facade. Each errant move they made was a bead of sweat trickling down their backs, a subtle admission of fear they dared not voice. They didn't know it yet, but their charade was about to unravel. I hadn't forced them to this precipice. I'd merely walked away and taken the ground with me. The absence of my presence, once an empty void, now throbbed with a chilling vitality they couldn't ignore. Silence is a mirror, and oh, how they were beginning to see themselves. Reflections distorted by their own insecurities. Their laughter felt forced, their conversations layered with a tension that hung thick in the air. I positioned myself just out of sight, an ever-watchful predator circling closer. The storm was brewing, and they were utterly unaware of the tempest I had carefully orchestrated. The whispers in the hallways turned into accusations, fingers pointed, alliances fraying. They looked at one another as though the familiar had become foreign, uncertain faces scanning the shadows for a ghost they believed they had dismissed. But I was right there, cloaked in the dark, a vulture hovering above the carcass of their morale. Every exchange now felt tinged with paranoia, every compliment a desperate clutch at reassurance. One by one, they began to turn inward. As they clutched their own doubts, I felt the power shift, a silent tsunami rippling beneath their feet, ready to pull them under. I allowed their fear to crescendo, tuning in to their discord like an expert conductor shaping a somber symphony. Each note of panic was a reminder of my growing influence, a hidden force directing their every move. They had set me up to fail, but now they were failing themselves, haunted by their own machinations. I could taste their desperation. It was sweet, intoxicating, and I reveled in it. They were reaching out, attempting to patch broken bridges, but it was too late. I had transformed their betrayal into my silent sanctuary. They didn't miss me. They missed controlling me, the strings I once danced on now severed. The clarity came crashing in. I was no longer their victim, I was their reckoning. I felt myself poised at the edge of revelation, the final act of quiet retribution looming. Their truths, once buried beneath layers of deceit, now floated to the surface like debris in an anguished tide. Carefully crafted lies unraveled one by one, spilling secrets and sowing seeds of doubt among them. They looked more disheveled, more lost, clinging to something that had already slipped through their fingers. I could almost hear their thoughts echoing in the vacuum I'd created, a cacophony of what-ifs and could-have-beens. I had escaped the shackles of their treachery, and now they danced along the precipice of downfall, unwitting participants in a tragedy that was mine to script. Each moment I lingered in the shadows only strengthened my grip. They had engineered their own demise through arrogance and overconfidence, oblivious to the predator closing in. Every deliberate beat of my heart became a drum roll, signaling their imminent collapse. Soon, oh so soon, the blade of my reckoning would slice through the churning storm of their despair. The ground beneath them was softening, and I felt the thrill of anticipation tighten around me like a noose. Every miscalculation they made deepened the pit beneath their feet, and I was ready to watch them tumble headlong into it. This was power reclaimed, not with shouts or violence, but with the silence of a storm building to a crescendo. My return, when it came, would be as sudden as lightning striking through darkened skies. I would not rage against their treachery. I would let their own fears do the work for me. In the end, I would stand victorious, the ghost they all feared, with my past transformed into the very weapon that would pull them under. They might have tried to bury me, but they had only succeeded in uncovering a force they could neither contend with nor contain. The tightening of their world mirrored the anticipation coiling within me, a predator at the height of its power, ready to strike. I observed them, shadows engaged in a dance of doubt, their movements clumsily masking the fear lurking beneath the surface. The air thickened with tension, electric with unspoken accusations and fragile alliances teetering on the brink. They were unraveling, and I reveled in the slow decay of their confidence. Each misplaced word, each anxious glance exchanged, wove a tighter noose around their collective necks, leaving them gasping for the certainty they had spun into silken lies around themselves. Silence became my ally, a lull before the storm that lingered in the echo of their nervous laughter. Their smiles faltered, Glances darted around corners, searching for the phantom they believed long gone. Oh, how they had mistaken absence for vulnerability. I was no longer the discarded pawn in their game. I had become the invisible specter holding the strings, each one a thread of malice tailored from their own fabric of betrayal. They didn't see the sniper's breath slowly exhaling in their direction, didn't realize the trap they had set for themselves was ready to spring with the slightest hint of pressure. I felt it tightening around us, the web of deceit they had spun now blurring the lines of control. Gone was the reassurance they had once drawn from my absence. Now, each moment of quiet cracked under the weight of paranoia. They began to dissect their own words, questioning the very loyalty binding them together. With every passing day, I gathered brighter insights, each observation a polished weapon to use against them. Fear, I realized, is sharper than any knife, and they were slicing through their own bonds with reckless abandon. They believed in their power, that laughter and camaraderie could obscure their faltering ground. Each sigh slipped through the cracks of their confidence like desperation trailing behind them, and I leaned into it, savoring the anticipation heavy in the air like the calm before thunder. The final piece clicked into place, a crescendo waiting to erupt, and I stood at the threshold. Me, the maestro of this dark symphony. They looked upon each other with questions they couldn't voice, a haunting realization of their own culpability dawning. They were staring into the mirror I had held up to them. But they couldn't apprehend the truth. They thought they were orchestrating my downfall, when instead they were becoming a mere echo of their own destruction. They missed the game I shifted to play. They missed controlling me. No one reaches for silence without knowing it is a trap, and they were unwitting players in a tragedy of their own making. Every fragment of hesitation I fed them spiraled into chaos, the battlefield sown with seeds they had mistaken for growth. Now, as I watched their fabric fray, I whispered to the void, a soft reminder that I was still here, and the damning silence would soon resound like a gunshot. It would resonate through their eager minds, flooding them with doubt. They would doubt each other, doubt themselves, and I would feign to step back, letting that tension coil tighter until it snapped. I wouldn't have to strike. They were doing all the work for me, meticulously crafting their own demise. I simply had to exist within the silence, the quiet hunter ready to strike at the right moment. While they fidgeted with nerves and buried questions, I stood as the embodiment of a calm storm, waiting, calculated, ready to pull the trigger. Soon, they would tumble, not from my hand, but from the very dread they had sown. The embrace of their self-inflicted chaos would draw them under, dragging them into a chaos of their own design, while I remained untouched, the unseen architect watching the falling walls of their empire. All those meticulous hours of gathering fragments, threading the celestial connections between their deceit, had culminated into this moment. They grasped at what remained as the shadows closed in, hearts thrumming louder than any shout. A reckoning was at hand that would leave them with nothing but the silent echoes of their choices. I would not break my silence. I would use it to construct a symphony of their undoing. And there, poised at the edge, I felt it. The collective exhale, the tremor of impending collapse. The storm stood ready, and soon, oh so soon, it would break. When it did, I would stand at the center, cloaked in shadows, the catalyst of their demise. I had turned absence into power, and their regret would be the echo that would resonate long after I had flipped the script. I watched them unravel from the shadows, an echo of their former selves, tattered and lost in a maze they thought they built to trap me. Their confident facade had become a brittle mask, one shattered by my absence, revealing the chaotic truth beneath. They had no idea the extent of their own deceit. The very scheme to break me had become the noose tightening around their necks. Conversations once buzzing with laughter now faltered into silence, replaced by the nervous whisper of self-doubt. They glanced at one another, searching for explanations they couldn't articulate. I relished the chaos. Each glance exchanged held a fragment of their fear, a flicker of uncertainty feeding into the riptide of their paranoia. They would soon learn. The puppeteer they thought they had silenced was wrapping their strings around their own throats. I hadn't struck. Not yet. I had spent weeks quieting the storm, and now it was poised to break, an inevitability that blossomed in the silence I had orchestrated. Their overconfidence staled like old air, thick and suffocating. They believed they had orchestrated my downfall, unknowingly laying the foundation for their descent. They thought they had rid themselves of the ghost that haunted their halls, not realizing that their very existence was now haunted by their own creation. With each day, I saw them splinter further. They were too busy clutching at the frayed edges of their alliance to notice the tightening grip of my vengeance. I had done the unthinkable. I had transformed their neglect into power, fueled not by rage, but by icy clarity. Every moment they spent trying to regain their footing was another moment of psychic erosion. It was a slow bleed, a meticulous extraction of their self-assurance. I didn't need to shout my return. I simply had to be. And suddenly, they were the fallen. They sang their own requiem while I orchestrated the melody of their demise, a soundless symphony that would climax with the crash of their own folly. In small meetings, I dropped pieces of information, planting seeds of doubt, letting them blossom into wildflowers of confusion. I saw their confidence wobble, a glass teetering on the edge of a table. They did not know the tipping point awaited them, crafted by my silent hand. They started to question their own motives, their alliances fraught with new tension. Whispers grew louder, not in support, but in fear. Fear of the cracks in their fortress which had once seemed impregnable. I withheld my voice in the chaos. They didn't need a ghost in the machine. They had become their own specters, shadow-boxing with fears of exposure and betrayal. Moment by moment, I savored the sweetness of their silent collapse, the grim satisfaction washing over me like cold water on a fevered brow. They believed they had silenced the architect of their ruin, but now they were just pawns in a game I had remapped. With each phone call gone unanswered, each invitation deliberately ignored, they felt the chill of my absence wrench at the fabric of their once untouchable security. It was a quiet execution, an intricate dance where I lead from behind, pulling strings tighter until they strangled themselves with their own paranoia. And when they finally turned on each other, when the chaos reached its peak and their world began to crumble, I stayed concealed, the silent observer, a poised predator ready to pounce at the moment of greatest confusion. What happened? They will question, eyes wide, looking among themselves for answers. But there will be none to find. They can't place blame where the architect of their destruction remains unseen. In their final hour, they will understand the depth of their folly. They will wear the red of their betrayal like a shroud. I will leave them to the ruins of their making, a testament to the hubris of their confidence. The fallen will cry out into the void, haunted by the ghost they believed they had buried beneath layers of deceit, unaware that I had taken root in the void they left behind. With a disdainful smirk dancing on my lips, I would walk away. to the next chapter of my life, free from the echoes of their treachery. I had left them something more tormenting than mere ruin, an unquenchable anxiety, heartbeats echoing with the weight of what they would never fully understand. That they had lost control, and in that loss, their inevitability of demise becoming a beautiful truth, one I had meticulously and silently crafted. They had set me up to fail. They never saw it coming. No drama, just the delivery of an exquisite masterpiece unfolding. They had gifted me the blueprint for my own resurrection, and I restored the balance, omitting the chaos, leaving a string of calculations that would reverberate throughout their lives. A perfect symphony of vengeance played without a note spoken. As I turned away, they would remain, unfurling against the backdrop of their own making, forever haunted by the silence of my cunning design. I stand alone now, surveying the remnants of what was once their empire and my pain. The echoes of laughter that once filled these hallways have been replaced by hollow murmurs, uncertainty casting shadows where confidence used to thrive. I'm no longer the specter they conjured to haunt their dreams. I've become something heavier, a gravitational force pulling them down into their own despair, though they will never see me coming. The ghosts of their betrayal whisper softly in my ears, remnants of a time when I was their pawn, played expertly on a board designed to keep me in check. Each calculated move they made danced along the line of calculated cruelty, a reminder that I was meant to fail. But I learned, turned that whispered pain into my strength, transcended victimhood into an architect of my own vengeance. The chains they thought they had fastened around my identity became the very tools I used to carve my freedom. As I glance back at them, I feel a calm wash over me. No longer do I harbor anger. It's been replaced by an impenetrable stillness, a fortress constructed from their own misdeeds. All those months of isolating myself, gathering their secrets, have converged into this moment. I didn't need to retaliate with noise or chaos. I only needed to exist. The weight of my absence has shaken them to their core. They thought they had won, each of them weaving tales of my collapse into their narratives, but the tapestry has unraveled. I've seen the fragility in their facades, the threads of loyalty pulling taut until they snapped, their trust a structure built on quicksand. Each word exchanged between them now trembles with doubt, each glance laden with unresolved questions. The void I left behind has become their prison, and I am gratified by the irony. I don't need them to know I won. I need them to remember they lost access. Access to my life, my power, my narrative. Those walls they built around themselves, they've crumbled, and I, the architect of their downfall, stand outside, observing a vulnerability they dared not acknowledge. They have become entangled in their own web of deception, wandering through the dark of their designs, unsure of how they arrived here. The road ahead stretches out before me, empty and serene, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic echo of my footsteps. As I walk away, I leave behind not just them, but the weight of what I once allowed them to dictate. My worth, my identity, my very essence. It was never about destruction. It was about liberation from the chains crafted to bind me. Closure feels real now, tangible like the cool breeze brushing against my skin, as if carrying away the remnants of who I used to be. I am no longer haunted. I am a force of nature, grounded and resolute. The clarity that came with the realization that revenge is not about noise, but about the subtle art of disruption. It brings with it an unspeakable satisfaction. Every miscalculation they made brought me closer to this moment, a quiet power, an unspoken victory. I turn, allowing the last vestiges of their chaos to seep away behind me, while I stride forward, shoulders squared, fortified in the knowledge that I emerged from the shadows, a titan shaped by betrayal but reborn through silence. Nothing can follow me here. I have rewritten the script, and now the story belongs only to me. I forge ahead, untethered, empowered, and ready to embrace the horizon. No more steps backward, no looking back. I am complete.